Hello and welcome back to The Lamppost Listener. My name is Daniel.
I'm Phil.
And this is a podcast where we chronicle transcendent truth by traveling further up and further into the classic works of children's literature.
This is Season 9, Episode 3, The Discovery, which covers chapters 7 through 9 of The Princess and the Goblin. And we brought in a very special guest.
The big guns today.
The big guns. We needed some help, and we brought it. And my father is joining us for the first time in 9 seasons.
Mr. Michael Wissenhunt, welcome to the show.
All right, thank you. It's quite an honor to be here.
Are you not going to call him Dad, too? I guess
No. Should I? Is that what you think?
Michael Wissenhunt is a longtime engineer and manager at IBM. He has a Bachelor of Science in Mathematical Sciences with a computer science option from the University of North Carolina, where he was a Morehead Scholar and a member of the NRABC. He is one of the biggest George MacDonald fans I know and has read each of his 36 novels at least twice.
At least twice. Welcome to the show, Michael.
All right, thank you very much. I'm glad to be here. This is my first time being on a podcast, but I've listened to a lot of podcasts, but they're mostly all yours.
I was going to say, do you listen to any other podcasts besides the Lamppost Listener?
I've just dabbled in a couple of others, but yours is really the one I stick
with. Only the other ones that we're on. You just follow us
that's
wherever,
true.
like
wherever you go.
From Jimmy Buffett.
That's right.
He's listened to every single episode.
All right.
Yeah. He's one of our Patreon supporters.
That's true. This is actually a great bookend because we had not planned this, but people who are listening, one episode after the other, the last episode we released, at this point, you actually had written into the show, and I got to surprise Phil with an email from you. You wouldn't have heard this yet because
no,
this
I haven't
episode
heard it.
hasn't been
Come
released yet, but
That's
you
right.
wrote us an email, and I read it to Phil. And so now you're just here. We kind of we conjured you, I guess. We read the email on the show, and then you appear to the next one like Beetlejuice.
Speak of the Michael, and he will appear before you.
He will appear. So before we get into these chapters that Phil mentioned, we're going to look at chapters 7 through 9 of The Princess and the Goblin. You have this long relationship with MacDonald. Phil and I are nowhere near as familiar with George MacDonald. This is, in fact, the first thing we've read by him. And we have a couple of questions for you to help us think through what does it look like, or how do we read MacDonald well? So the first thing I just be curious about is why do you love George MacDonald so much? You've read all of his books twice. Phil and I have a podcast on Lewis, and we haven't read all of his books even once. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think the thing that really draws me to George MacDonald is this incredible view of God as our Father and the love that God has for us. It just comes through so well in the things that he writes. Another part of this for me is I like the way I think when I'm in the middle of a George MacDonald book. I just have a much more hopeful, higher view of who God is.
So interesting that you would say that. And I think you even mentioned this in your email, that you like the way you think when you read him, because one of the things that we've been uncovering throughout 7, 8 years that we've been doing this show is how we spend a lot of time reading Lewis. In the same way, we've realized, wow, there's a transformative power that good literature has. And this is not something we've uncovered. We're not the first people in human history to discover that literature has a special power. You're saying that MacDonald has that same power that we found with Lewis.
Right, yeah, very much so. I just love the way he tells a story. He's a great storyteller. You mentioned this in the first episode of this season, what C.S. Lewis had said about his writing. But he's a great storyteller. And just the appeal to the imagination, which is something else that C.S. Lewis talks a lot about as well. But just imagining the fullness of who God is and the love that God has for his people. And one of the themes that one of the themes that George MacDonald will take through many of his books is showing the progression of a character to go from kind of knowing who God is, or everybody at that time was a part of a church, but the maturity of coming to know Christ in a much deeper, richer way. You see that as a major theme in a lot of his books, especially his novels.
Yeah, and so you read We Sir Gibby to me
Right?
growing up, and
Can we just pause just for a second? I hate to interrupt this wonderful father-son moment. It took me, when I was editing that first episode where you mentioned this, I did not know what the name of this book was. I didn't know it was WEE, like we space Sir space Gibby. I thought it was some Scottish thing that I just didn't understand. You're like, we Sir Gibby. And I'm like,
it is. That's exactly why you were struggling with it, too.
I was so confused because
you probably ended up ordering something from Nintendo.
But I did not understand that. And again, because we're ignorant of George MacDonald in many ways, I didn't realize he had a book called Sir Gibby, and this was a younger version of it, which is, it's cute that it's called We Sir Gibby.
Yep.
But I just thought it was some Scottish name or something. So in case any of our other listeners are also confused, that's the name of the book is 3 words.
Right. And we, WEE, We Sir Gibby of the Highlands. And the way I remember it is that book, even though it was rewritten for a younger audience, it was still above my head. It was it wasn't the one that I said I heard blah blah blah.
No, that was Mrs. Polyfax.
Yeah, he also tried to read. Is it Dorothy
Gilman?
Gilman?
Dorothy Gilman wrote a series of books about an old woman who was a spy in the CIA.
Yeah.
But books that I loved reading as a teenager, I guess, and I tried to read it to you when you were too young for it. So I read like a page, maybe a page and a half, and you looked up at me and said, "Daddy, all I hear you say is blah, 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 blah." So I folded the book closed and I put it off till another time.
Right.
Did you ever finish it?
Yeah, it did come back later. I did really enjoy it later. But it's this theme of my dad.
You didn't mention that you were 18 months old at the time.
Yeah. I was actually pretty advanced to be able to articulate that all I heard was
to be able
blah.
to say that was impressive.
I think that you're always reading things above my level, not only in a kind of academic or literature sense, but also on a spiritual level too. And I think that you set a really good precedent for it. And then you also, it wasn't like you were reading super high above my level. You were just pushing me a little bit. And so the books would have vocabulary that I didn't quite understand, but it informed my faith in ways that I didn't even understand at the time. And it informed the books that I picked out. I remember reading Little Pilgrim's Progress by myself. And I think that because you had read We Sir Gibby, I had a place to start, and I understood some of these things. And when I hear you talk about George MacDonald, I realize, I think some of this stuff seeped in pretty early, and I'm so grateful for that because it laid this great foundation. And the Narnia work that we've covered, and The Princess and the Goblin, which is the only George MacDonald book we've covered so far, both of these works, they take stuff that we learn from the Bible, but they present it in this different way. That kind of, if you Daniel and I both grew up going to Presbyterian churches, we heard these stories and we heard the Bible being read to us all the time. At a point, it kind of starts to, you get used to it and it's not as fresh. But I think one of the great things about these stories is you get to see the same concepts in a slightly different way. And it makes you pay attention in a different way.
Right. Yeah.
We read that line in sometimes fairy stories, blah, 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 with the whole, the name of that New York Times article that Lewis wrote in the, was it 60s? I think it was late 50s, early 60s. We covered that just last season, and that's where he famously says that he was hoping he could strip the stories of their Sunday school and stained glass associations and kind of show them in their full potency. And I think one of the wrong ways to hear that is that, he's trying to make them more palatable for us, or he's trying to make them, he's doing like, he's Thomas Jefferson with his Bible. Like that's,
trimming out the stuff he doesn't like.
Yeah, and that's not at all what Lewis is saying there. What he's saying is he's actually, what you're saying here, Phil, with MacDonald, is that it's like the bus that passes by our houses. We both live here in the city. We have city buses that pass by.
They're extremely loud.
Well, but sometimes they are, and other times you just don't hear it at all.
Right.
I don't hear it every day, and the bus goes by my house twice an hour, and sometimes I hear it, and sometimes I don't. And that same thing can be true of our relationship to some of the truth in these stories. It's sometimes we feel it. Sometimes it's there and it feels potent, and other times it doesn't. And it's not because we've even done something wrong, but we're so familiar with them. I think about it now with my own kids and my son, who's about 4.5 now. Some of the Bible stories we'll get them reading. It's like, oh, Daniel in the lion's den again. Like, he's already getting, overly familiar with it. And it's not a bad thing, but it's something where, oh, you actually are missing maybe some of the magic that's there, some of the transcendent truth, because it becomes so familiar. And this can help. These kind of beautiful books can help us be able to experience it almost fresh again.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, we have another question for you, Michael. I'd love to know a little bit about any recommendations you might have for us as first-time George MacDonald readers. Are there any things that we should be on the lookout for, things we should be aware of, things that we might just be ignorant of and not realize that we're unaware of these things?
Yeah, so I'll give you a little bit of history about how I came to know about George MacDonald. And that was, first of all, I should go back even further and explain what the NRABC is.
Oh, that would be helpful. I wasn't going to ask.
It's a little bit ironic that when I was a teenager, I've read very little. And so I would joke about being a member of the NRABC, never read a book club.
Oh,
and that's
I thought we were getting political all of a sudden on the show.
That's right. That's why I did want to clear that up before I got labeled in a certain way.
Interesting.
The National Rifle Association before Christ. Or
no,
something.
I was like really confused. Like, I didn't know there's other letters there.
So after I married my English major wife, I started getting really interested in reading, and I started reading what would be considered the classics. And I would ask my wife, have you read this? And she said, oh, yeah, I read that in 6th grade. So there's a lot of the books I was reading. Well, shortly after we were married, we were invited by a friend to visit her in Nashville, Tennessee. And so we went out there. We were with her for a few days. But the first day we were there, she gave me this book by George MacDonald. She said, I think you would like it. And it was kind of interesting because she knew my wife much better than she knew me. But I am so grateful for that time we had there and her introducing me to this book. It was edited by Michael Phillips, and it had a different name. It was called The Maiden's Bequest. And Michael Phillips ended up editing 18 or more of George MacDonald's books. And the way he would edit them is he would shorten them quite a bit, because George MacDonald wrote in a time where people had nothing else to do but read books. And
they had a lot more trees back then, too. They weren't concerned about the paper and everything, right?
And he wrote very long books. And so Michael Phillips would edit them. He would edit some of the sentences as well, because George MacDonald, as you may have seen in some of this book that we're reading now, his sentence structure can be a little different than what we're used to in modern times. The other thing he would do, Michael Phillips some of the books have a lot of Scottish in it, the Scottish dialect, and he would translate that, but later on he started keeping more and more of the Scottish because he wanted people to get a sense of that. So some of the original books, there'll be a lot of the Scottish dialect in it. But anyway, that first book, The Maiden's Bequest, I'm trying to think what the original name of it was. Alec Forbes of Broughton or something was the original. And so this was published by Bethany House. And one of the things that Bethany House did, much to Michael Phillips' chagrin, is they would title the books things and put on the front of the cover that this is a Victorian romantic novel.
Gosh.
And one of the books was The Tutor's First Love. And so I was always a little bit embarrassed to carry this book around,
That's the
because
kind
it
of
made
book,
it look like it was a romance novel.
that's the kind of book that you get a grocery bag and you
Right.
make your own cover.
I'm just trying to protect the book, that's all. I am looking at some covers of The Maiden's Bequest right now, and they look like romance.
Right. They all have a picture. All
Yeah.
the books will have a picture of a man and a woman, and a little different than what you might expect from some other romance novels because they have Victorian clothing and stuff like that. But that was the way they marketed it. So they were marketing these books. It seemed like primarily to women. So that was a little bit embarrassing for me. But I love the books, and there is some romance to it, but as I said before, a lot of the themes are about someone coming to know Christ in a deeper way, in a much more mature way, and then sometimes there's a relationship that kind of comes to fruition by the end, but not always. The other thing that Bethany House did, what was really smart for them to do, was on the covers they would put a quote from C.S. Lewis, usually the one that says, "I've never written a book where I didn't quote George MacDonald," because nobody knew George MacDonald, but everybody knew C.S. Lewis.
Sure.
And so that was a great way to do it. But what the gift that Michael Phillips did was he reintroduced George MacDonald to modern readership. And so I'm very grateful for that. So those books, I'm pretty sure, are still available. What's happened in the last number of years is to be able to get the e-books, or for me, iBooks. Since I have an iPad, I read a lot of them on. You can easily download these, and they're free because they're way out of copyright. Some of them you can pay a little bit, but like $2 or something. So one advantage to some of the books that have the Scottish dialect in it is some of those books will have glossaries at the end.
Oh, that's helpful, yes.
Yeah, but I did learn, it was really hard when I first was kind of trying to read the Scottish, because I came to a point where I thought, I want to read the original instead of the abridged, edited version. And so I would download them and read them. I had a hard time, but you get better at it. And as you do it more and more. So about 8 years ago, I'd set George MacDonald aside for a while because I'd read all the ones that Michael Phillips had edited. But then I thought, I want to go read the originals. And it was about 8 years ago that I started. And that's when I kind of came to the realization, I love the way I think when I have a George MacDonald book going. So I thought, I'm just always going to have one going. And I tend to read, 3 or 4 books at the same time. So I just have that. I read some, every day. And so I'm on my I made a list of about 36 books that are kind of the novel form, including, with The Princess and the Goblin and The Princess and Gertie. So I just go through them, and I'm on my third time through since 2016. So,
do you have last question for you? Do you have a favorite one in those?
Yeah. So the one that Philip brought up, We Sir Gibby. The original is Sir Gibby, and I think it's called The Baronet's Song is the Bethany House version of that. I would say that's historically been my favorite.
Okay.
But since I've discovered the ebooks, there's one that Michael Phillips did not edit, and it's called The Annals of a Quiet Neighborhood. It was one of the first ones he wrote, and I would say it's my favorite now. And it's about a pastor who comes into a small community and just gets to know the people and to serve them, and there's very complex stories. George MacDonald can be accused of having characters who are too good, good and evil characters and stuff, but there's really a lot of nuance in that book in particular. So I would say that's my favorite right now.
I think both of us have, and you were way ahead of me on this, but we have both been craving work that is deeper and richer and that has stood the test of time. And I feel like for you, George MacDonald is that author. I've recently found so much joy in reading longer books that have been around for a longer amount of time.
Right.
Specifically, Dostoevsky and Tolstoy are the ones that have been really special for me lately. But even in reading this, The Princess and the Goblin, there's something about it's just old enough that it feels like it's from somewhere else.
Right.
It's a little bit different. All the tropes that he may have even started, some of them, they just feel different because you're this far removed. And I think the same with the Scottish. It feels a little bit, it's a different culture. It's enough that we can understand, but it also requires you to stretch a little bit each time.
Right, yeah, and that helps with that kind of imagination. When you read the Scottish, you're in Scotland, right? It feels like there is this character who are these characters. So even the ones that have the Scottish in, it's just the dialogue that's in Scottish. The narrative is in English. So it's very readable, and then you get to the Scottish, these are Scottish characters, and your mind goes and pictures the Highlands and what that might look like, because he's very descriptive in describing the landscape and a lot of the details, even the facial features of a character. He spends a lot of time on that in the novels that he writes.
But there's something about the pacing that also puts you back in that time, in that place, because there was the same amount of time, but the perception of time was different. You were less hurried, and I think you have to slow down to read these. And I love what you said about how you get better at it, because if it had been up to me and you had read this, if you had given it one try, I probably would not have kept going. But because you kept pushing, I got a little better at understanding it.
Right.
And then by the end of it, I was understanding much more than I was at the beginning. And I found that in the past 4 years of rediscovering a love for reading, in addition to the Narnia stuff. Mainly it was having a different living situation and noise-canceling headphones so that I could focus.
And that's when you got married. A different living situation is a weird way to describe I got married.
I had a different living situation before I got married.
Oh, okay.
And that was where I rediscovered the love for reading.
I thought you were just implying like it was when Sarah made you read, which would be fine if that's the case.
Yes. Go read a book for.
Yeah, she's like, I need you to go put your headphones on and read a book.
Yeah, but I feel like I had to relearn how to read, because I was not able to read the more difficult stuff. And I was telling Daniel and another person recently that I could not have read Brothers Karamazov probably even 2 years ago. I wasn't ready for it. That was so thick. Sometimes you go 3 or 4 pages without a paragraph break. It's exhausting. But I had to work up to it. And I think that you've done that with reading 36 of these in the original. And that's you have to, I hope you'll link to some of these books just so people can get a sense of, it's actually a pretty challenging read at first, but it's also very rewarding. It matches how challenging it is.
Right, yeah. So I think, Phil, one of the things I've never talked to you about is when you were growing up, you were a great reader. You would read all the time. And as we were trying to decide, whether you would be in public school or private school or Christian school, you just started in public school and you did really well. And one of the reasons was if there was ever a lull into action, you would sit down and read. And so you read really well. And then I noticed maybe it was around college or a little after that you didn't seem to read quite as much. And I thought, it was kind of made me a little sad that you weren't quite the reader that you were when you were younger. Yeah. But then you've really kind of turned that around and are reading much more now. Yeah. And as you say, challenging books.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There was a low point sophomore year. I remember I read one book. It took the entire year of both semesters of school to get through this one book. And then I started one more. So I think I may have had 2 for the calendar year. And I don't ever want to go back to that again. Yeah. I do remember those 2 books really well.
But what were they?
The Brief Wonderful Life of Oscar Wilde by Junot Diaz.
Sure, yeah.
And Galatea 2.2, which was about training AI by reading to it. And a lot of the stuff seems to be coming.
Oh yeah, I've actually heard of the first book, not familiar with the second.
Yeah. That's really interesting to hear, because I think the podcast was a big part of this too, is reading stuff and rereading it. So we read each book twice, and then preparing for it and having to write summaries. It was the only writing I was doing for a little bit.
That's true, yeah.
Because we had to get it down to under 150 words, and so Daniel played a big part in that.
All right. Well, this has been a great conversation, but it's time for us to transition into these actual chapters. And it is starts with an odd chapter, chapter 7. So I actually have the summary. Any final thoughts before we go into the mines with Curdy?
I want to point out real quick the version that my dad's holding up.
Yeah, tell us about it.
The Princess and the Goblin. This just came out. It came out.
I thought this book was really old.
Yeah, this version of it just came out.
Okay, that's
it has
fair.
new illustrations. I received it for my birthday recently.
Is it from the Rabbit Room?
It is.
I ordered it from the Rabbit Room, but it's actually published by Walking Together Press, which I haven't heard of. But they work together with an organization in Jos, Nigeria, to encourage reading in that country as well. But it just came out, and I had for Philip's birthday, I guess we gave that to him as well as the other.
Yeah, there's a sequel
book.
to The Princess and the Goblin.
Are you going to say what it is?
I'm not going to say the title.
Oh, okay.
No
I was
spoilers.
waiting for you to mention. I'm actually excited about the title of the sequel. And the more we read this, the more I'm intrigued, which I have not read it, but I become more intrigued by The Princess and Curdy, because you kind of could call this book The Princess and Curdy. Mm-hmm. So what's happening in the second book that gets that name? I don't know. But speaking of...
The sequel came out 10 years later, which is kind of a curious thing.
Interesting.
Too,
Yeah, not
right?
like an immediate sequel.
Right. Yeah.
Well, speaking of Curdy, we spend all 3 of these chapters with Curdy. Princess Irene does not make an appearance, and what Curdy uncovers in the mines beneath the mountains is interesting. So here's our summary for chapters 7, 8, and 9. Curdy returns home after safely escorting Irene back to her castle. That night, he frightens off goblins hiding beneath his window. In the morning, Curdy heads down to the mines to work and stays late into the night. While taking a break, he overhears a conversation between a family of goblins through a thin part of the stone wall. Curdy's eavesdropping reveals that the goblins have hard heads and very soft, toeless feet. When Curdy hears the family leaving for an important meeting, he creates a small hole in the wall, crawls through it, and begins trailing the goblins. Curdy eventually arrives in a large hall and hears the Goblin King announce his plans for the deliverance of his people. Curdy leaves the meeting and heads back home, but not before filling up the hole in the wall to cover his tracks.
It's a regular espionage novel
By a
But
12-year-old.
right?
By a
But in a
12-year-old.
cave.
So let's look at chapter 7 here, which was a very short chapter. It was entitled The Mines. And in this chapter, Curdy goes home, and what happens while he's sleeping?
It's such an odd moment. He hears the goblins, and then he wakes up, makes some noise, starts humming a tune, and they scamper away, and then he goes back to sleep and sleeps the rest of the night.
Yeah, they're beneath his window. He scares them. I was like, it's fine.
Yeah. If I was editing, I might even take that part out.
Yeah. Like that makes Curdy not seem brave, but just foolish.
Yeah. And it's also just such a funny bump in the action. It doesn't really move forward. It's just this. It's almost like a denouement at the beginning of the book.
Well, it does reveal, though, that whatever has happened has upset the goblins more than just simply annoying them. Because Curdy, as he goes back to sleep, or maybe it's the next morning, that he thinks to himself, okay, well, I scare the goblins off all the time, but they actually seem bothered by my behavior. So it kind of does let us in, and even let Curdy in on the fact that maybe something else more than just their regular old...
Right.
Them being a regular old nuisance is going on. And we do find out in the very next chapter, in chapter 8, oh, wait, they're actually planning an invasion into the overland, as we called it back in the Silver Chair.
And I think that's why it's still in here, is that it has a little bit of foreshadowing.
Mm-hmm.
It indicates that, something's different. This has never happened before. He might have stumbled on something.
Sure. We then actually travel with Curdy and his father down into the mines. We hear about the relationship that the fathers have a lot of times with their children here. They're very very laissez-faire about the kids in the mines. We learn that it's not all that abnormal for a person or two to stick back after hours and do some overtime work. And it's also not weird if that person's 12 years old.
Yeah, this is very similar to my upbringing. I would ask, "Hey, Dad, is it okay if I can
Go
stay
play in
here?
some caves.
I'm gonna play in this cave for a little bit, earn a little extra money for Mom's coat."
We also are well aware of the literal goblins who live in this cave, but we're fine with it.
Right, and as everybody leaves and says goodbye to him, they're acknowledging that he's not afraid of them.
Yeah, don't forget to sing because the goblins might show up.
Yes,
Right.
with complete confidence that he will be able to handle himself. And they said even if he forgets one of the songs, he can just make one up.
Yeah, and they said that in some ways that actually bothers the goblins more because they're so impressed with like the improv.
Yeah.
Anything else from this chapter? Because it is a really short chapter here.
Yeah, there is a point where the father talks about having confidence in Curdy's courage. And that idea, that virtue of courage is something that you find comes up quite a bit with George MacDonald in his books. Courage is a high-held virtue, I think, in his mind. And it shows up in different ways, and usually subtle ways, but I think that's something that he would consider an important thing.
Yep. And as we'll see several times, it's the action. It's not just being courageous. It is taking action with that
That's
courage
true.
and
Right.
being willing to actually do the thing that he is talking about.
And we saw that in the last episode, those last few chapters with Irene, with the way that she acts like a princess. And I came across, I was reading a book called, oh goodness, I forgot the name of the book, but it was a collection of different little essays on George MacDonald. Oh, it was called Rethinking George MacDonald. And I came across a chapter in it by Christine Chettle. And she read this really interesting point about what MacDonald is actually doing, both with Curdy here and his virtue, but also with, and especially with Princess Irene, but we didn't mention it last time, but I think it's worth bringing back up. This is what Chettle writes. So interesting. Listen to this. MacDonald democratizes the word princess. Every girl is a princess, as she's quoting him here. But, this is back to Chettle, but emphasizes the moral requirement of this role. Going back now to MacDonald's own quote, "I have seen little princesses behave like the children of thieves and lying beggars, and that is why they need to be told they are princesses." She then says, MacDonald sets up a new moral hierarchy. Anyone can be a princess, but princesses do not lie and they do not steal. There's a new social hierarchy in terms of morality. And that's what we're seeing here. I mean, you mentioned earlier, Michael, that sometimes MacDonald gets maybe accused of having characters that are too virtuous. But it seems like that's the point. That's
Right,
actually what he's
exactly.
attempting to do.
Right,
It's not a
yeah.
fault. It's actually a part of his plan, right?
Yeah,
And I love
that's
this
true.
line that he emphasizes the moral requirements of this role, right? It's a princess story, but it means something to be a princess.
Right, yeah. He'll do that in some of his more realistic novels as well, when he describes someone who is or is not a lady or a gentleman, and it all has to do with behavior. And that's what is key for him.
Moving into chapter 8, though, we get to the goblins, and that's the name of this chapter, the goblins. It's here that Curdy, through a very thin portion of the wall, is able to listen to a conversation between what appears at first to be a family of 3, then a family of 4, and then actually maybe quite a host of goblins, all inside of a emptied out goblin apartment, I guess, if you will.
One of the annexes.
Yeah.
I just want to point out that there's a unsung hero, a secret player in this first paragraph.
Ooh, tell me.
That leads, if it weren't for them, none of the rest of the book would have happened. It's the fact that morning he had laid his bread in a damp hole in the rock. And if he hadn't done that, I think the bread would have been really crunchy, and he would not have heard the voices of the goblins on the other side.
So he's got that nice, soft, wet bread.
Soft, wet, maybe even a little moldy.
Oh, goodness.
And he's just quietly chewing, and then he happens to overhear this conversation. And
Yeah. Then what does he discover in this conversation?
well, it sounds like somebody's about to move out to was their apartment, but they're on their way out. and it sounds like there are a bunch of them, and they are aware that the humans are either too close or something has set them off, and it's time for them to go.
Mm-hmm. And in all of this, there's a couple of things. It's interesting. It's one of those conversations where it's just dialogue back and forth. And what's actually really cool about this scene is you don't really know who's talking for a lot of the time. Like every once in a while, a character might say "mom," blah blah blah, and then you go, "Okay, so obviously it's not the mom. It's one of the like children or teenage goblins, however old they are." But there's other times where it's unclear exactly who's talking, and this would be exactly how Curdy feels on the other side of that wall, just trying to hear what's going on.
Yeah, you pointed out earlier that we don't know. There's no said so and so or anything, and I actually think it works because it feels like we are in the dark.
Exactly. Yes.
And we don't know who's saying what, but you can hear enough by the way they address each other.
One of the things.
Well, one of the things that McDonald does to help us out, though, is the dialogue is, "You say so, Dad. I confess, my boy.
Mm-hmm.
Ain't it yours too, Father? To be honest, I have, there's this.
You get a
back and
little bit of
forth
it,
that
exactly.
They address each other enough, which is enough to help us kind of picture in our minds
and
how that conversation.
It's also strange enough because I don't know about you, but I don't usually remind the family members I'm talking to what their relation is to me, unless you're trying to make a point.
But
yes,
you could also,
Dad. Yeah.
Yes.
But you could also imagine that this is a family structure where this is normal conversation for
exactly.
them. Out of respect, they would say Father
Mm-hmm.
when they talk to them. Yeah.
What we learn here, before we actually get to the plan that's going down, is we learn about the odd things about goblins' bodies. We learn that they have extremely hard heads.
Mm-hmm. They're very strong.
Yes, and physically hard heads. They're not. They probably are stubborn too, but they have very physically strong, hard heads. They have extremely soft feet, and they don't wear shoes, which is odd. You'd think if you have very soft feet, you might want to cover those things up. But one of the jokes here that could be made is, as humans, we have hard heads, but not like goblins. They talk about how soft our heads are, and yet we don't walk around with helmets all the time.
Right.
You know, so Phil does, but it's like we tease him about it, right? But we also learn they have no toes. In fact, there's a point. I don't remember the actual line. I don't have it right in front of me, but we learn that the queen does wear shoes. Kind of, it's like a tradition, and that one time the father here saw her without her shoes on, and she has these little like slivers.
Yeah,
What's
a great description of her feet.
Yes, but same thing with their fingers as well, and that McDonald actually makes a point that some other people have said that this happened because actually the fingers and toes, these like digits, developed over time, and because the goblins have lived underground, they just never developed toes or fingers, which is really interesting.
Yeah.
Well, and that's kind of the opposite of what a friend of mine said. He has a very small pinky toe, and he would joke and say, "Well, I think I'm more evolved than other people.
I don't need this one."
That's right. Exactly. So kind of the opposite.
None
of
of us need it, and he's actually gotten rid of his.
I thought it'd be great to just pause for a moment to think about the very idea of goblins, because when we think of goblins, now we mentioned this too back in Narnia with dwarves, but our view of goblins is so incredibly skewed by Tolkien. Mm-hmm. Like when we all think, and I don't mean that in a bad way necessarily, but goblins, which have been around since the early 14th century, so we're talking like early 1300s, around the same time that, the Divine Comedy is being
a
read.
bestseller.
No, that's right there in the New York Times, But when this is happening, that's when we really see the idea of goblins come into folklore. They might have been around before that. We have no record of it until the early 14th century. And in that, though, what's interesting about goblins, they really don't change very much throughout the centuries. They remain kind of about the same. Their physical features change a little bit, but they are quite silly still. They're a nuisance and they can be bad, but like we see here, they're antagonists, but they're not frightening antagonists as often. But there is a little bit of a change during the Victorian era with things like The Princess and the Goblin here, as well as Christina Rossetti's Goblin Market, which is like a long narrative poem that comes out about 10 years before. And it's really not again until Tolkien that we see goblins transform into what we think of them often. And again, I'm speaking broadly, but we think of goblins maybe as being like relatively dangerous antagonists.
Right.
But here they're still antagonists, but they're just not as frightening.
Yeah, and there's one point where he calls them gnomes,
Mm-hmm.
which is interesting. Of course, we have our own view of gnomes today because of commercials and, and stuff.
when I was reading about this and looking at the etymology of the word, it's one of those things, and Tolkien told us this about fairy tales itself, where it's kind of hard to see exactly where it comes from because interestingly enough, some of the ideas about goblins appear around the same time in different parts of Western Europe. So like, wait a second, like, isn't that odd that we see the word like we see some German stuff showing up not too long after we see some French stuff showing up, and there's not quite a place. Different people have different views as to where's it coming from first. But in that, there's also a correlation between things like gnomes and hobgoblins and other kinds of things too, as well as there's similar kind of creatures in the East too as part of their folklore. So it's interesting that there's this creature just exists throughout human folklore, like a humanoid creature that's likes to live underground and bothers you and frightens you and is dangerous, but kind of like a loose dog might be dangerous, not like a murderer. You know what I mean? Like,
right, yeah.
Which is like when we think of goblins or like orcs now or something like that. Oh, these are very bad, vile things. Whereas goblins are like, oh, they're these like silly nuisances.
Yeah, and if you thought of goblins like gnomes, you wouldn't think about them being dangerous, right?
Exactly. And what's interesting is Lewis even includes, he never calls them goblins, but the gnomes that we meet underground in the Silver Chair are a little bit like this as well too.
Right.
Where they're weird, and there is a worry that Eustace and Jill have when they're there, but not like if we were to throw them into a cave with a bunch of like Uruk-hai, from Lord of the Rings or something. So I just thought that would be that's interesting to think about the ways in which our view of Goblin has just changed in the last 100 years.
My view changed in the early 2000s when Willem Dafoe played one in the first Spider-Man movie.
When he dressed up like a Power Ranger, pretty much.
As the Green Goblin.
Are you a fan if they were to whenever there inevitably is another Green Goblin in a movie at some point, do you want the like big suit like they had in Sam Raimi's ones, or do you want them to wear more like comic accurate, which would be like a costume with like a face mask on, not a helmet?
Oh, interesting.
Because like if you think about it in the comics, so if you even go back to like Stan Lee, Steve Ditko, I'm talking like literally the 60s when the characters first introduced in that first run they have. Because I think he's introduced in the teens, like maybe Amazing Spider-Man number 13, I want to say is when he first shows up. It's almost like a Halloween costume that Norman Osborn puts on. It
looks like it's made out of fabric.
Yeah, it's like fabric. Yeah. Would you ever want to see that, or do you like the...
At least once. I feel like they've been doing this. They keep teasing the costume. It's always an Easter egg at the end of a show. Mm-hmm. Someone will glance over and look at something from the comic books and say next time, and then and then move on. But it'd be nice to see it at least once.
I would love
if they're gonna keep making it, which
they will.
They're contractually obligated to do so. If they want to keep the rights, then sure, go ahead.
Michael, do you want to weigh in at all on the Green Goblin?
No, actually, I was just thinking this is the part of your show when I tend to nod off.
This is the real reason that we brought in the big guns to keep me on track. It's
we were talking about goblins. It's like we're going to get way too much into a Spider-Man poll here. We got to make sure we don't do that. Is Green Goblin your favorite of the goblins? Just of all stories.
Of all stories,
do you rank the goblins?
I'm not saying that. Let's wait till the end of this book.
The Dancing Lawn next month.
Yeah.
Let's rank the goblins. All right, well, this chapter ends, and Curdy does decide to follow these goblins. He's able to move a couple of rocks out. He goes through the hole, and he actually begins following these goblins until he arrives at the hall of the Goblin Palace. And here he actually is able to listen to the Goblin King.
We get a sense of the pseudo hierarchy, or I guess it is a hierarchy.
It is. No, it is. Yeah.
Yeah,
Like the social order within the goblins.
right. There's one person talking and everybody's listening to him, but then someone interrupts and it seems tense for a minute, but then the person in charge graciously lets them speak, and we start to get hints of what their plan might be.
Yeah, we learn about this plan they have to break through to. We don't know what the plan is exactly. In fact, there's actually multiple plans that are going on here, but there's an idea of it's now our time for deliverance has come. We're going to actually take back what is ours. And again, what's actually unclear to us as readers is how long it has been. It's obviously been a very, very long time. How long that is, we don't know. Are we just talking generations and generations? Are we talking centuries? Are we talking millennia? I mean, we really don't know.
Long enough to lose your toes.
or not develop them.
Or not
Yeah.
developed.
But it's now time for the goblins to go back and take back their kingdom. Some interesting stuff happens with Glump. Tell us about Glump, Phil.
Well, before we move there, I just want to point out that for a split second, I thought that my education in environmental science in 8th grade was going to come in handy, because he just starts talking about stalactites.
Oh, okay, yeah.
And
yeah.
I thought, that's the one that hangs from the ceiling and goes down.
Do you remember how did you learn how to remember stalactites
They're
and
hanging
stalagmites?
on tight.
And so, yeah, the same thing. I was like, stalactites hang tight to the ceiling, and stalagmites might grow to touch the ceiling. I don't know if that one's actually nearly as helpful, but
Well, I've never used it until now, and I was so proud of myself. And then the rest of the sentence was, so stalactites, far older than the mines, hung from their roofs. And I thought, oh, okay, well, if you're just going to give it away to
you're
everybody.
like, I didn't actually need to know it.
Yeah.
What a bummer.
Could've
Is
gotten
that
it
all
from
you remember
context.
from 8th grade earth science?
Yep.
Water cycle, not familiar with it. This is all why you're always talking about the participation from the sky. That makes sense. You didn't pay attention.
Actually, I did the Christian version of the environmental science program, and that's where I learned that there's no condensation for those in Christ Jesus.
So you go give me credit for that or
Yeah,
not?
that one's directly from my dad. I was
There
gonna,
you go.
I was
there you
gonna
go.
say this in the intro. Most of my puns came from the training of being at the dinner table with my dad.
That's great.
And add in an English major mom, and you understand why I am the
You're
man
able
that
to
I
do it. Oh, that's so
I
good.
am today.
Oh.
I literally cannot, because of you, Dad, I cannot hear the word condensation.
Without
I have to
thinking of that.
use all my self-control not to say it in certain groups.
Mhm.
But man, if I'm in a Christian circle, I definitely use that.
I feel like that's what maybe your pastor said growing up is why we didn't need to turn the AC on yet, right? Like, like no, it's fine. You guys know what the Bible says. Well, Glump comes forward here, and what does he have to say?
So he interrupts the chancellor, and someone calls him out for it. But then everybody around knows that Glump's here, and he has this long roundabout way of talking.
Yes, he has a very formal way of speaking to the chancellor.
But he basically presents a backup plan, right?
Yeah, this is one of those times where actually, and I'd love to get your thoughts on this too, Michael. I was reading through this. The first time I read through this chapter, I honestly was a little confused. I found myself going, wait, what just happened? I'm not exactly sure. And I had to go back through it and read much slower to actually understand. I wonder, because even you're saying this as a big fan of McDonald, that, hey, sometimes the sentences are maybe just a little bit harder to comprehend. And it's not that it's incomprehensible at all, but having read Narnia, which I think is very easy to read, even though it's 70 years old. It's got, a younger audience in mind, and it still very much feels like very modern language. I don't think I was ever reading through Narnia and like, wait, I'm confused as to what's happening. Whereas here, it was unclear to me how many plans were going on at first, and then who exactly Glump was proposing this plan to. Like, is it actually to the chancellor or not? I mean, am I alone in that?
Well, I think there were two plans, and Glump was just saying the second plan, if we're going to use it, may have to happen sooner than later.
Yes.
Because they're so close. So I don't think it was a third plan that
okay.
he was giving. It was just saying, we've talked about this second plan, and we may have to do it pretty soon because they're almost breaking through, and we're moving our family, and it'll still be another 10 days or whatever, but we may have to move up the timing.
And he says that the failure of the former will render the latter imperative. So if it,
So there's two plans. They're going to try the first plan first. If they can't do that, then they fall back to the second plan. But these two are already in plan to begin with.
And the second plan, we don't know all of the second plan, but it's going to absolutely involve this large body, like underground body of water, this reservoir of water that's been discovered.
perhaps an aquifer.
That's near
Trying
behind.
to make up for that.
What do you say?
I'm trying to make up for my lack of education in
Okay.
environmental science.
Yeah. So the second plan would use this potentially to maybe flood or at least wash away some of the stuff. We don't quite know exactly, but all of this leads us to these two plans that are putting all of the humans in danger. And it's at this point that Curdy actually turns around and is like, I need to go back. I've heard enough. He doesn't hear, the entire plan or anything, but he knows enough to be able to go back and share.
And that the fact that he walks away does two things. One, it leaves more of it up to our imagination, where we don't get all the details, which could get very boring very quickly if you're going to give away the entire plan of what they're trying to do. But it also communicates the urgency behind his movement as he goes back out. And the fact that news made him want to get back shows that this is a big deal to Curdy and his people.
He does get back, and he talks to his father about this. Phil, I'm sure that in your teenage years, those early teen years, you 12 years or so, and you go home, you might tell your father about a mistake that you have made or a discovery that you've had. And you don't have to share any of the times where you've gone kind of like puppy with your tail between your legs of, Dad, I made a mistake. But Curdy does come home, and he didn't make a mistake. He actually has this big discovery. But I would assume that your dad never said, you know what, thanks for sharing. Let's all go back to bed, and we'll talk about this in the morning, which is exactly what Curdy's dad says when he runs. Is like, hey, I think there might be an invasion being planned. As Dad's like, oh, wow, great work, son. Let's get a good breakfast in the morning and we'll talk it over. And then just go to
And
sleep.
he also says we probably shouldn't work that area for a while. It's very wise.
So this definitely tells us at least that Curdy's father is certainly not ambivalent about it, but he's not overly concerned. Like, we've got to run and warn the townspeople not to go straight to the castle. It seems as if, again, they don't take the goblins maybe as seriously as you and I might as modern readers.
Yeah, and I'm curious, is that a lack of understanding? Because they haven't interacted with each other very much. So maybe they don't understand how large the threat is. Mm-hmm. But also maybe he thinks, well, that's not a very good plan.
Oh, he's just not worried about it. Like, that's fine.
We can get some sleep.
Yeah. But again, I think it's interesting because of the way in which it presents the goblins. They're just these interesting antagonists to us because of the fact that they're not the world. Like, what I love about this as a fairy tale is so much of our modern fairy tales or modern fantasy or science fiction, kind of these big things, is always about saving the world. It's never just protecting your house. It's always, you've always going to be saving the entire world from the absolute worst possible bad guys. And this is more like, this is just saving, your village from some annoying things,
Right.
Which I like the fact that it's Dad's not like, this is not the end of the world right now, at least.
Right.
Well, I think part of it, too, is knowing that the goblins are expecting the timing to be a few days away.
That's true. They have 10 days or
least.
so, I think you
right,
said.
Right, yeah. So they know where the miners are and how long it'll take them to follow the load to break into and then find an empty apartment. Mm-hmm. And, when Curdy was looking at it, it didn't even look like an apartment to him. He didn't understand.
It's true, yeah.
Right. So I think that plays into it as well.
I think it actually shows an example of the father's wisdom and maturity. And he listens and he wakes up. It's not that he's asleep the whole time and just not able to be roused. He wakes up, he hears it, and then he decides the best move for everybody is to sleep soundly, which they do, and then go and communicate it. And you think about the alternative, they could go wake everybody up, and then what? What is the next action step that has to happen right then? So it's this great mix of Curdy's running back, but then his dad is kind of calming him down and saying,
Yeah.
Right.
we have a little bit of time.
No, that's interesting. I almost feel like convicted in my way of viewing this. Is like we've got to address all of this right now, and that is a way I personally handle a lot of things. Like it's always going to be addressed right now. Time is always of the essence. Nothing can ever wait. And some of that is just the world that we live in, the very fast-paced kind of Western world that we live in, where everything's got to happen right now in our culture. And so I have a tendency to view the Curdy's dads of the world. He has a name, but I don't remember what it is. His father, he actually told us last time. I forgot what it was. Because Curdy, remember Irene and him were confused because he was like, I'm so-and-so's son. And she's like, who's that? And he's like, he's my dad.
That's right.
Yeah, I've forgotten.
But I have a tendency to view people like that as not taking their time seriously or being unwise, when it might actually be that they're doing the wiser thing here.
Right.
But it just can be really hard to slow down because everything feels like it's the most important thing, right?
This is actually something I see quite a bit at work, where my reaction is someone reported a problem, we need to fix it right away. And some days that is still my reaction, unfortunately. But the more experienced people are so calm when they hear it. And they just take in the information, they ask a few questions, and then they prioritize things based on the information they get. Because they know that this isn't the end of the world. We do have a few minutes, and we're actually going to be more effective if we slow down and pick which problem we're going to work on first, and then take it in order.
Yeah, it reminds me of an image I have. So my dad was still is a high school football coach, and we long ago had a doctor who was always on the field with us. And if there was an injury on the field, then referee would call for the doctor to come out. He would slowly walk out carrying his doctor's bag, traditional doctor's bag, and just take his time. And I'm like, this guy's injured. Why aren't you running out there? But from his experience, he knows he doesn't need to rush out there. He can take his time to go. So
yeah.
I want to think about what this week, we're recording this on a Sunday night, what this week can I actually take my time on and not rush through? I'm going to kind of challenge myself with that. Because
you should walk home really, really slowly.
Yeah, I'm not going to do that. If it wasn't,
why don't you take tomorrow off?
I do have tomorrow off, which is nice.
There you
go.
Oh, there you go.
I do have 2 children, so
why don't you just listen to what they have to say and then go to sleep?
There you go. We'll figure it out. I'll try to find something that I can do that with this week.
Curdy's dad is Peter.
Peter.
Yeah,
okay.
we couldn't remember it because
Curdy's
it was
dad
so
is
normal.
Yeah, just like Curdy. That is interesting. He's like, we have friends like that. I know some people that have pretty normal names, and they're like, what can we think of of our kid and stuff? That's definitely a knock at you. Sorry, I didn't mean it like that.
It went downhill quickly.
I didn't. We didn't tell anyone that Barney is the name of your son.
I named my kid THX 1138. Okay.
Well, any final thoughts, Jim, before we wrap this episode up?
I think it is interesting the way George MacDonald creates a scene and then goes to another scene and then goes back. So you're going to see in the next chapters, you're going to learn more about Irene. And there's this back and forth from the mind, to the castle, and then the worlds will merge together at some point.
Yeah.
But it's interesting the way he kind of goes back and forth and develops an area and then goes and develops another area and then comes back.
Yeah. And I think that goes to that we talk a lot about the C.S. Lewis quote that he's not a great writer, but he's unmatched in terms of storytelling. And I think his natural ability to go back and forth like that, even though he has a few, to us, awkward sentences, the way he crafts the story and builds it up and keeps interest. And these are shorter chapters. It is aimed for a slightly younger audience, and it keeps us going back and forth and giving us information from each side.
Well, great. I think that's a great place for us to wrap up this conversation. We can look forward to, we're going to see more of Irene in the next episode, which we're entitling The Conversation. And in that, we'll cover chapters 10, 11, and 12 of the story, where Irene will have a confusing conversation with her grandmother, and Curdy will keep digging. So, all right. Well, this episode, before we actually do that, I want to say thank you again to our guest, Michael Wisenhunt, with us, who, great transition. He's also a supporter here on Patreon.
He's a patron of our show.
Exactly. So
he also paid for most of my stuff.
Ever.
Yeah.
Ever. That's true. So
definitely the first 18 years plus college and
some fraction of the podcast equipment we're currently using right now, because that's all Patreon money.
Right.
So
the equipment came from birthday and Christmas gifts. All of my George MacDonald books, including the C.S. Lewis George MacDonald quote book, came from my dad.
It's an anthology book, but yeah.
Anthology book.
The quote book. I like yours. The quote book. Yeah. So thank you again, though, for coming on the show. It's been great.
It was so fun. Philip told me, I think yesterday, I was going to be on.
That's how quick. We've known about this for a week. So what, you just waited till yesterday to do this?
I think. Yeah.
It's okay.
Yeah.
You wanted to show off how fast you could roll this off, right? Like Phil's like, we'll ask my dad 24 hours before, no prep. You've had no notes in front of you this whole time, by the way. You're just sitting here rolling all this information.
It's all in his brain.
Yeah. Well, this episode is made possible by Patreon supporters like you, Michael. If anyone else listening would like to support the show, you can listen to a bonus episode each month along with other rewards.
It's a special podcast called The Dancing Lawn. It's very exclusive.
It's $2 a month.
If you thought that the little riff on the Spider-Man universe was fun, imagine an entire episode like that for every month for the past 4 years.
If you didn't think that was fun, you can just think of it as a donation to us, and you don't have to listen to the other podcasts.
It's definitely not required to listen to it.
Which is actually fun, because every once in a while we will see, and I know some of our Patreon listeners know that we see this, I will see someone who's been supporting the show for 3 or 4 years. I think we've done 70 episodes there, because we do one every month for the last, however many years. And someone
Do
would
you
be
not have a Bachelor of Science in Mathematical Sciences?
Well, I did, but there was no option for anything else. So,
computer science?
No, I have a degree in elementary education, so we used a lot of colored pencils when I got my degree.
Good for you.
Did you take finger painting 211 or 212?
No, 352, man. They let you go really high with that one.
What all did you cover about dry erase marker boards and stuff?
I do love the fact that on this podcast between you and I, you have a coloring degree and I also have a coloring degree, but just by different names. Yours is called digital communication. No, what is it? No, communication arts.
Yeah.
And mine is elementary education, but both of it we just colored a lot.
Both of us had conversations with fellow students who thought that we were legitimately taking finger painting.
Oh yeah, no, my grandparents still think that to this day.
Yeah.
We want to give special thanks though to John Marr, Emily Wakefield, Ryan Smith, Andrew Trophy, Becca Brown, and Christiana Line for supporting us at our very top tiers. You can always email us at hello@lamppostlistener.com or call us at 406-646-6733.
That's a direct line to Daniel, by the way.
I should say, you should leave us a voicemail. Do not, if you call us there, we will not answer, just so you know.
That's kind of rude, don't
you can
think?
also, sorry about that. Well, we don't get a notification about it until after you've left the voicemail.
Right.
It's not that we see it and choose not to pick up. It is not a cell phone number. It is a Google Voice number. We know where the area code is. Isn't it somewhere out west? I think it's Wyoming or Montana, I want to say.
You probably would have picked it.
That would make sense. I have family there, so I think that's probably what I would have picked.
You have cattle there.
No, I have family there, too.
They take care of the cattle. Okay.
I don't see them very often, but we had some cows over there, too. You can also visit our website at the Lamppost Listener. No, not the. Sorry. Visit our website at lamppostlistener.com.
Not the Lamppost Listener, which we are no longer associated with.
Yeah. You can find links, though, there to past guests, reference books, and many other things. As always, we'd appreciate a review wherever you listen to this podcast. Thank you for coming along on this journey, and we'll be back next time with The Conversation.
See you soon.